Pinnacles, set aside for its rock formations, but those rock formations are really kind of island in a matrix of chaparral. And here we are on this image from the California Chaparral Institute, located just east of Monterey. And if you can see our little polygon there, you'll see that we really are quite blue in that image. And here, where you can see the sort of general vegetation groups of the park, yellow represents chaparral. In fact, 82% of the cover of the park is chaparral. That chaparral is really dominated by chamise and chamise buckbrush alliance, Ceanothus cuneatus. There are also stands of pointleaf and bigberry manzanita, as well as other shrubs, particularly in more mesic areas. Like everywhere, we've had our share of fires. This is a fire history decade showing major fires by decade at the park. If you'll pay attention, if you'll kind of notice, a little hard to tell because there's a lot of overlapping images, but the yellow represents the fire areas last burned in the 30s. Some areas were uncolored, were burned in 1900, or actually some areas in 1877 was the last fire. Over 60% of the park hasn't burned in the last 90 to 150 years. 85% of the park has been unburned in the last 50 years, and more than 99% hasn't burned since 1998. This is our #1 plant in the park. Interestingly, particularly in these areas that have not burned for a really long time, we do have some really pure stands of chamise, sort of single-age closed canopy stands. Like here, here, here. I mean, you can look at those dark patches, not everywhere in there, obviously. Here. We also have a lot of rare species in the park, a lot of biodiversity, which is really found particularly persisting in the gaps in chaparral in those edge spaces. A lot of these are really rare, pretty regionally restricted plants like the Pinnacles buckwheat, the hooked popcorn flower, Robin's nemocletus. That flower is about the size of a grain of sand. And then a really rare plant, the San Benito pentakita, has only been seen once in the park, and this was directly after a prescribed fire in the 80s was collected. And then this species, the Indian Valley bush mallow, is restricted to the area in the general vicinity of the park and the county. However, it's quite rare, but it's really only as rare as fires are rare. Every single time you have a fire, it is almost 100% cover if it's in a shrub area. And then we also have, I mentioned our pointleaf manzanita. That manzanita is quite distinct in some ways from other pointleaf manzanita, and it was described in the 70s as Arctostaphylos cheloniorum, and there's some question about whether that should be resurrected. Incidentally, that was the day I was born that it was described. And then there's a number of other kind of rare species that are found in the scraps. So one question with parts of the park that have not burned in so long is there any threat to the seed bank of some of these rare species in areas that haven't burned for potentially over 150 years? Current fire management in the park is a 100% suppression model. That's because of the flammability of the surrounding vegetation. Also, the park is only 27,000 acres, so it is a relatively small area. And then much of it is very inaccessible, no roads for the most part. Our current fire management really limits our use of prescribed fire. It's constrained to only occur in these areas that are in yellow, called the adaptive area. To a certain extent, it can occur within the developed area, but it's not allowed at all in chaparral in the park under our current management. It's only allowed in the front country grassland and woodland areas. and a new EA would be needed to expand its use. Those uses that are allowed are specifically for invasive species management and for cultural burns in our current. And there's also no prescribed fire allowed within the wilderness areas, and the wilderness dominates most of the park. Now, that was not always the case. This is a map or a graph showing fires. In orange is wildfires, and in blue is prescribed fires. And you'll see that we have a rather large blip in the 80s. And this map over here is another fire map of the park, and with the year of each burn, and you'll see those sort of halos of burns. Those were a whole bunch of prescribed fires that were undertaken. The goal of these burns, these 60 burns that they did in about 3 years, was to reduce fuels and stop unnatural chaparral encroachment into the assumed oak woodland. They had an assumption that the park was naturally oak woodland and the chaparral encroached it. And they also wanted to protect infrastructure. This did little, according to our own analyses later, except for cause type conversion in parts where they burned to non-native annual grassland without a significant risk of reduction in risk. And then to that point, this is about what it used to be. At least we do have a map from Weisslander from 1935, and you can see that chaparral also dominated in that era, actually 89% of the area he mapped. So fear and risk is real too. This is a fire that occurred in a small portion of the park. They put it out really fast in 2021. But this is our suppression difficulty map. And you can see that we have almost the entire park is in the highest difficulty. And we did a risk assessment for our infrastructure in the park, for our buildings. This is where all of us work and many of us live. You can see that the risk is really high. And those of you familiar with what happened at Whiskey Town will know that that can be a really traumatizing thing. And right now, our management of fuels is restricted to these small sort of blue and yellow areas in the park. A new fire management plan is proposed for the park. And with that, I've been tasked with the question of, should we consider allowing prescribed fire in chaparral? And as we've heard a lot today about some of the reasons why we should give that a little pause before considering it. Some of the pros, however, is that most of the park has not burned for between 50 and 150 years, and it's possible that we're losing some of our rare seed bank. There are some secondary effects, sort of similar in a way to what we heard about before, but post-fire sand deposition may actually be an important secondary process for us that supports some of our rarer sand annuals. And it could potentially, and this is a lot of the driver for the management questions, reduce fire danger, though those effects may be pretty short term. And it could make managing wildfire easier. However, fire breaks for prescribed fire plus burn ground is a big weed risk concern for me. Type conversion if another wildfire comes too soon. Fuel reduction is pretty short duration, potential limited utility. And of course, there's always a risk of things going out of control. So for me, the cons still seem to outweigh the pros for considering prescribed fire in chaparral. Maybe some of these risks of not having prescribed fire can be mitigated in other fashions. But with changing climates, literally and figuratively, we have to always reevaluate our assumptions about these things. So please challenge mine. Thank you.